Now, when we look up the Ionians, it says the Ionians were one of the four major tribes that the Greeks considered themselves divided into during the ancient period. Alongside Dorians, Aeolians, and Achaeans, the Ionian dialect was one of the three major linguistic divisions of the Hellenic world, together with the Dorian and Aeolian dialects. Now, if you read Stolen Legacy by George G.M. James, he talks about Ionia. He talks about how philosophy was stolen from the ancient Egyptians by the Greeks and passed off as Greek philosophy. Now on page 12, he says, the Ionians and Italians made no attempt to claim the authorship of philosophy because they were well aware that the Egyptians were the true authors. He goes on to say, for this reason, the so-called Greek philosophy is stolen Egyptian philosophy, which first spread to Ionia, thence to Italy, and thence to Athens. And it must be remembered that at this remote period of Greek history, i.e. Thales to Aristotle, 640 BC to 322 BC, the Ionians were not Greek citizens, but at first, this is the big part, at first Egyptian subjects and later Persian subjects. Now, when we look at the map, we can see where Ionia is. We know it's modern day Turkey. But at this time he's talking about, it was not yet part of the whole Greek territory. It later became part of Greece, and I'm going to get into that later. But the key part is, how did the Ionians become Egyptian subjects? He didn't say Egyptian citizens, he said Egyptian subjects. So how did they become Egyptian subjects? So according to Herodotus, and I'm going to paraphrase this story because there's a lot more to it, and to save time, I'm just going to paraphrase. But according to Herodotus, Psamtik I was stripped of his power and chased into the marshes by 11 kings that ruled inside of Egypt. Now, the reason why they did this is because they believed that Psamtik I was going to become powerful enough to strip them of their power, and he was going to eventually rule all of Egypt by itself. So they chased him out of there. Now, he ended up getting mercenaries. He ended up getting help from mercenaries from the Ionians and from the Carians. Now, they helped him get rid of these kings, and he basically ruled all of Egypt. Now, to thank them for helping him out, he gave the mercenaries land along the Pelusian arm of the Nile, and they settled there, and it was there for a long time. Now, Ahmose II, when he came into power, he moved the Ionians to Nacretis, Egypt. Now, he gave that city a lot of privileges. They had a free port there. They basically had a monopoly on international trade. He gave them land to build temples. They had their own assembly and their own administration. Now, the Ionians, along with the Dorians and the Aeolians, they built Hellenion, which is basically a Greek sanctuary in Nacretis, Egypt. So understand what I'm saying. The Greeks had a sanctuary in Egypt. This is something that they are not talking about. But the Greeks and the Carians also had a marketplace there. They had a marketplace in Bubastis and in Sais and in Memphis, Egypt, and Lower Bubastis. So they were trading there. They had a marketplace. This is something that is not talked about Egypt. They're not telling you about what really was going on there. Now, the Greeks that was in Egypt also sent silver to Greece to help with the reconstruction of the Temple of Delphi. Now, this is like history that is not being talked about. And it's crazy when I go and I start reading the Bible, when I start reading a lot of things that have to do with religion. This part of Egypt is not talked about. This history is not talked about because it destroys the validity of the Bible. And then we're going to get in and I'm going to show you this whole free port that I'm talking about. We're going to show you because this stuff has been proven. Herodotus wrote about this stuff and we found it. So as I said, the writings of Herodotus have been proven true time and time again. Now, a French archaeologist by the name of Frangadio, using the writings of Herodotus, found a sunken city in the Nile Delta. Now, this sunken city was called Heracleion by the Greeks and called Tanis by the ancient Egyptians. Now, and when they found this sunken city, I mean, it had a free port there. It had ships and they found boats. They've been pulling up statues and pulling up things for a long time from this place. But it just validates everything Herodotus is talking about when he's talking about these free ports and when he's talking about what they had at Naucratis. So it shows you that the Greeks was engaged in trade with the Egyptians. And everybody knew about it, but nobody's talking about it because it destroys the validity of the Bible. It paints the ancient Egyptians in a whole different light when you start finding these things. Now, and I've been trying to get people to read the book Hebrew is Greek for years by Joseph Yehuda. Now, the book is $1,800. I understand that, but you can get a PDF. It's a little bit thinner, lighter. It's not as good as the actual book, but you can read it. Now, it's a reason why this book costs $1,800, that I want you to understand that the Hebrew language comes from Greek. And he proves 100% in this book that the Hebrew language comes from Greek. Now, there's a couple things and a couple points he wanted to make in this book. I want to read to you a few of them. Now, he says that Judean and Ashdodite were not more different one from the other than Hebrew is from Arabic or Aramaic. That the Jewish, the Christo-European, and the Islamic cultures, the triple aspect of modern civilization, all originate from Hellas. That the Hebrews worship Greek gods and follow Greek customs. That Hebrew has a multiplicity of unsuspected dialects and homonyms. That many proper nouns in the Bible, whether divine, ethnic, geographical, or personal, resemble Greek proper nouns, while others have Greek adjectives and common nouns or homologues. That judging by the proportion of epic and poetic homologues and by the primitive grammatical structures to be found in the Bible, one is impelled to the conclusion that the ancestors of the Jews must have been among the noblest and or the most ancient of Hellenes, and that they spoke a language far more ancient than classical Greek. That when the Hellenic affinity of the Phoenicians had long been forgotten, it was assumed that the identity of the Greek with the Phoenician alphabet was simply a matter of borrowing. Herodotus 558 he cites. So let's go to Herodotus 558 and look what Herodotus is saying. Herodotus says, these Phoenicians who came with Cadmus and whom the Japherians were a part brought with them to Hellas, among many other kinds of learning, the alphabet, which had been unknown before this. I think, to the Greeks, as time went on, the sound and the form of the letters were changed. At this time, the Greeks who were settled around them were, for the most part, Ionians. And after being taught the letters of the Phoenicians, they used them with a few changes of form. In doing so, they gave to these characters the name of Phoenicians, as well quite fair, seeing that the Phoenicians had brought them into Greece. The Ionians have also formed, from ancient times, called sheets of papyrus skins, since they formerly used the skins of sheep and goats due to lack of papyrus. Even to this day, there are many foreigners who write on such skins. So now, you have Herodotus sitting there talking about the Greek alphabet. He goes back to the Phoenicians. Now, does anybody pick up on the problem here? What are we missing? If you are talking about a sort of etymology of an alphabet and you go back to the Phoenicians, how can he go to the Phoenicians? This is the key part. Herodotus never mentions the Hebrews. So if you're talking about where this language could have came from, how come Herodotus, he talks about the Phoenicians, he talks about the Ionians, but he doesn't talk about the Hebrews, who we are told by the Israelites and by everybody else who believes in his Bible that the Hebrew language is the first language, that it all starts with Hebrew. So why is he not talking about Hebrew? Why does Herodotus never mentions the Hebrew? He doesn't talk about them because, one, he died before the Greeks invaded Egypt, and there was no such thing as a Hebrew at that time. And again, I know people are going to say, well, Greek mythology is not older than the Hebrews. I'm going to prove that. We're going to go through all that because you have to understand what's history and what's the Bible. The Bible is not proven history. So just because the Bible says so doesn't make it true. But we're going to go through that later. Okay, so understand what Joseph Yehuda is saying is when he starts studying this Greek language, when he starts tracing the etymology back and going way back to the dialect and to the alphabet, that it fits with ancient Phoenician. So then he goes and cites Herodotus, and Herodotus is backing it up, saying, yeah, the Phoenicians brought this whole alphabet. Now understand, he said alphabet, he didn't say language. So they had to be speaking something before this alphabet, because they obviously was, conversing with the Egyptians. So they obviously spoke Egyptian or some kind of language. So they was obviously able to communicate with the Egyptians. So he's saying that the Phoenicians bring in this alphabet and teach them this alphabet. The Ionians had this alphabet, but they edited it. They changed it around a little bit to fit their dialect, and they played with it, and they came up with something different, which we know today is Greek. We call it Greek, but when you trace it back, it goes back to Phoenician. So he goes off of this, and he does the same thing with Hebrew, and he can trace it back. I mean, he does it very well in the book. He traces it back, and it goes all the way back. You can see, as he was saying about how homologues and certain things is just changed slightly to where you can tell this is the Greek language. He did all the homework. It's done. And other people as well follow his work. He actually already proved 90% of the letters in the alphabet goes back to Hebrew. He died before he could finish the other 10%, but other scholars picked up where he left off and proved the other 10%, proving 100% of the alphabet goes back to Greek. But if you don't do any research, you wouldn't know this. Herodotus backs it up. Everything backs it up. And it goes back to the Ionians again. So again, let's look at this. Who are these Ionians? And when we go in to read again, it says the Ionians were one of the 4 major tribes that the Greeks considered themselves divided into. I know I read it already. I'm going to read it again. During the ancient period, alongside the Dorians, the Aeolians, and the Achaeans, the Ionian dialect was one of the 3 major linguistic divisions of the Hellenic world, together with the Dorians' Aeolian dialects. Remember, that's why he had to say the Aeolian dialects. It was a dialect. He's gone into the language. But when we scroll down, this is where it gets good, because everybody's waiting for the whole, where's the Bible come into play part. When we scroll down, look at what it say. Biblical. In the book of Genesis of the English Bible, Javan is son of Japheth. Javan is believed nearly universally by Bible scholars to represent the Ionians. That is, Javan is Ion. So who is this Ion? Let's take a look. It says, according to Greek mythology, Ion was the illegitimate child of Creusa, daughter of Aristeas and wife of Zeus. Creusa conceived Ion with Apollo, then she abandoned the child. But let's scroll down here where I have highlighted. It says, Ion was also believed to have founded a primary tribe of Greece, the Ionians. He has often been identified with the Javan mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. Let's look some more about this Ion. Greek Myth Index. I got it highlighted down here, the part I wanted to show you. It says, however, her object was discovered, for as Ion, before drinking, poured out a libation to the gods, a pigeon which drank of it died on the spot. Creusa thereupon fled to the altar of the god. Ion dragged her away and was on the point of killing her when a priestess interfered, explained the mystery, and showed that Ion was the son of Creusa. Mother and son thus became reconciled, but Zeus was not let into the secret. The latter, however, was satisfied, for he too received a promise that he should become a father of, it says vis-a-vis, which basically means we're talking about Dorius and Achaeus. But who is Doris and Achaeus? We're talking about the Dorians and the Achaeans, which is part of the 4 tribes of the Greeks, which makes up the Ionians, the Achaeans, the Aeolians, and the Dorians. So it says down here, it says, after the death of Silenus, Ion succeeded the throne, and thus the Aegelians received the name of Ionians. Ionians, and the town of Hellas was built in honor of Ion's wife. So here we go. We attaching Greek mythology to the Bible, but it's going to get deeper than this. It's going to go much deeper, because I know a lot of people were saying, how is this older than Hebrew? And you got to remember that you're talking about a book. The Bible is a book. It's not proven history. We're not finding any ancient writings from the Hebrews that's predating Herodotus. We're not finding anything. If the Hebrews did everything that the Bible spoke of, there is no way they would not have been mentioned by Herodotus and other scholars. I'm talking about before the time. I'm talking about during the Homeric period. But we're going to get into all that. Okay, let's continue. It says, additionally, but less surely, Japheth may be related linguistically to the Greek mythological figure Ipetus. Now it says Ipetus, also Japhethus, was a Titan. Now, you scroll down, it says Ipetus and Japheth. Ipetus has been equated with Japheth, the son of Noah, based on the similarities of their names and on old Jewish traditions that held Japheth as the ancestor of the Greeks, the Slavs, the Italics, the Teutons, and the Javadians. See Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews. So when we look at Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, I'm just going to give you this little reference. It says down here, Javan, Ionians, Greek. That's the only thing we need to see. Now, I have shown you before in my last video about how much Greek mythology parallels the Old Testament. And you can go look at Eve and the apple and look at Pandora's box. We could look at the whole Noah's Ark story and look at Deucalion and Pharaoh. You got Hercules, you got Samson. So it's a lot of other things. We can just look at the Old Testament. You can look at God and Zeus, or God and Kronos, or Satan and Kronos. It's a lot of things we can compare Greek mythology with the Old Testament. Now, first thing you got to ask yourself is, if the Greeks stole that from the Hebrews, then you would have to prove that they knew of the Hebrews before the time of Homer. You would have to prove that Homer could read Hebrew and that he knew about the Hebrews. You will not be able to do that. You will also have to prove that Greek mythology was not worshipped by the Greeks before the Greeks invaded Egypt. You can't do that. We're going to go by proof in this video. I'm going to go by proof and what the proof tells us and what the facts tells us. Now, you can stick your head in the Bible and believe everything is in there, and you're going to be stuck just like these Hebrews is, but that's exactly what they're doing. You would sit there and believe, of course, Hebrew is older than Greek mythology, but it's not, and the proof shows that it's not. So when we get into Greek mythology, how far back does it go? No one really knows, but we know it goes back at least to 1000 BCE, because we can date the Iliad by Homer between the 11th century and the 8th century. We know that Herodotus speaks of Homer, so we know that Homer was something that was talked about and he exists. Now, a lot of scholars, debate about Homer, and they think that the stories that he wrote about was just folklore. He was just the first one to put it into writing. But people talk about Homer. Herodotus speaks of him. But not just that, we can go to the British Museum. We can find artifacts from Greek mythology that dates between 480 and 400 BCE. We can look at the Temple of Zeus, which dates between 472 and 456 BCE. We can look at the Temple of Poseidon, 440 BCE. We can look at the Temple of Delphi, which is older. That goes from 548 BCE, where they held the Pantheon Games. This is where we get the Olympics. Now, you cannot find me an equivalent from Hebrew. Find me any Hebrew structures that's older than these. These are still around. The ruins are there. They existed. You will not find me any Hebrew structures or anything that existed that is older than what we see here in Greece. So we can't say that the Hebrews came before Greek mythology or the Old Testament came before Greek mythology, because there is no proof. You can't back it up. You're going from a Bible. It's just a book. There is no proof. No proof to back it up whatsoever. So now, this is supposed to be the oldest example of Hebrew writing they found in Israel. Now, when you go to the National Geographic website where it talks about this piece of pottery that they found, now notice, this is the picture that you mostly see when you try to research this situation. They don't really give you a good look at the actual piece of pottery, not a really, good look. But when you go to the website, it says here, oldest Hebrew text is evidence for Bible stories, ? Now, the actual article goes on to say, the exact nature of the text believed to be Hebrew, written in Proto-Canaanite script. That's not Hebrew. A type of early alphabet has yet to be determined, but a number of words have already been translated, including judge, slave, and king. But the archaeologist's claims are disputed by an Israeli colleague who says there is not enough scientific information to reach a definitive conclusion. So here comes this Israeli, a Jew, who's saying, no, this is not Hebrew. We can't go ahead and just say it's Hebrew. There's not enough information to make a definitive claim. So you got a lot of people who was looking at this situation and just saying, no, it's not Hebrew. It's not Hebrew. Now they will lead you to believe. They always tell you it is believed to be. They will lead you to believe that it is Hebrew writing, but it's not. So why not just be honest and say this is not Hebrew? We should know definitively that it is. They have to make this connection and somehow put Hebrew in ancient Israel when that's not the case. We know the Egyptians was there. But when you go to the next page, it goes on to say, Tel Aviv University archaeologist Israel Finkelstein, who was not involved in the Ela excavations, agreed the site is very important, but has significant concerns with Garfinkel's interpretation of the findings. Immediately drawing ties between the site and the kingdom of Judah is a mistake, he said, and it might as well have been Philistine in origin. Also, due to the small number of samples, the carbon-14 dating of the site is also not as precise as it should be, he added. We need to wait for more samples. It's not enough to date the site based on 2 olive pits, he said, because that's what they use to carbon-14 date a piece of pottery. So how are you going to use olive pits when we're talking about Hebrew writing? Well, that's how they do. Now, he goes on to say, he also expresses doubts about the counterpiece of Garfinkel's finding, the text. I am prepared to predict that it will be very difficult to determine whether the text is in fact Hebrew. There will be evidence indicating various possibilities, he said. And the nature of its discovery, this piece of pottery is also not unusual. There is a group of late Proto-Canaanite pottery shards from the same chronological phase that have been found in various sites on the coastal plains. None of them were discovered in Judea proper. So here comes this other archaeologist who's saying that they jumping the gun on this, and it's not Hebrew. So when we go back and we try to start finding ancient Hebrew writings, you're going to always only find a piece of pottery or a shard or something on like a wooden board, something that a 4-year-old could carve into a board. Now, if you get a piece of pottery, if you get something that's old, you can carve whatever you want into it and say it's Hebrew. You need to find stuff like we found with the Greeks. You need to find civilizations. You need to find like whole documentation. It's so unbelievable to me that these people supposed to have existed for so long. They're supposed to have existed for so long and done so much, yet there is so little about them. The ancient Egyptians are so old. Look how much we have on them. Look how much we have on the Greeks. We got a lot of information. We have structures, we have bodies, we have everything. But you can't find nothing when it comes to these ancient Hebrews who's supposed to be ancient. Their writing is supposed to be older than the Phoenicians, it's supposed to be the first writing. But yet, they keep trying to mix in the Hebrew language with the Phoenician, when it should be the other way around. But you can't find any Hebrew. Now, they want to sit there and tell us that, well, God destroyed Jerusalem, or he destroyed Israel like 20 times in the Bible, and a lot of the information got lost. But if he did that, why do we have so much of Egyptian artifacts that we found in Israel? Why do we have so much proof of Egyptians being in Israel, but not actual Hebrews? Now, of course, when I say not actual Hebrews, I mean during ancient times. But they want us to believe that this piece of pottery goes all the way back to the time of King David. Now, we're talking 1000 BCE to 800 BCE, somewhere in that time frame. But of course, there was no such thing as a King David. Now, we are told in the Bible, when you read Samuel chapter 5, 6 through 10, it says that King David basically gave the name Jerusalem to Jerusalem. That before he took over Jerusalem, that it was called Jebus, and the Jebusites was there. So you would have to prove that Jerusalem first was called Jebus before that time, and that there was a people called the Jebusites. You will not be able to do that. When we go look it up, this is what we find. So it says here, the siege of Jebus. Now you go down here, it says, Niles Ptolemaic notes that every non-biblical mention of Jerusalem found in the ancient Near East refers to the city with the name Jerusalem. Offering an example, the Amarna letters, which are dated to the 14th century BCE and calls Jerusalem Yerushalemu, he states that there is no evidence of Jebus or the Jebusites outside of the Old Testament. Some scholars reckon Jebus to be a different place from Jerusalem. Other scholars prefer to see the name of Jebus as a kind of pseudo-ethnic name without any historical background. So here it is. He's saying that nobody has found anything that refers to a Jebus or these Jebusites. There is no such thing. The people never existed, period. You got to understand, history doesn't lie. You can go ahead and believe this one book if you want. When you go through the actual research, you can't find these people. So now when you read Samuel chapter 5, 6 through 10, when it's talking about King David taking over Jebus from the Jebusites, it never mentions anything about any Egyptians being there. It doesn't speak about Egyptians. But we know the ancient Egyptians was there. We know they was in Israel and ruling Israel around that time because we found artifacts dating back to that time. Now, when you look at the artifacts that they found in Israel, we know that it is proof that the ancient Egyptians was there. So when you go to, this is an article from ArtNet News. It's talking about these artifacts. It says, more than 300 ceramic artifacts were excavated from a cave in Negev. Now that's South Israel. Most of them in astonishingly good condition. Archaeologists also unearthed dozens of jewelry items made of bronze, shell, and faience, as well as unique stone tools made of yellowish alabaster, seal rings, and makeup flacons, all dating back to 1500 to 1000 BC. It goes on to say, most of the scarab seals found in the excavation date to the 15th and 14th century BC. Dr. Daphne Ben-Tor, curator of Egyptian archaeology at the Israel Museum, explained, during this period, Canaan was under Egyptian rule, she said. Now, we already know that the ancient Egyptians and the Canaanites have a history that goes back to the Bronze Age. Now, I want to read to you an article from the University of Pennsylvania. They have a museum there of archaeology and anthropology, and they also have a large collection of Egyptian artifacts. So it says here on the website, Canaan in ancient Israel. It says for more than 300 years during the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, Egypt ruled Canaan. Deities, arts, and technology were intermingled between the two cultures. The Egyptian culture developed alongside Canaan and ancient Israel for thousands of years. Early on in its history, Egypt was unified under the rule of a single king or pharaoh in the old kingdom of Egypt. Now it gives you a date. 2675 to 2130 BCE. So where are the Hebrews? At this time, where are the Hebrews? We're talking about the ancient Egyptians and the Canaanites uniting. So if the Hebrews was there first, because they'll tell you the Hebrews was there before the Canaanites, but where are they? Now, they wasn't being enslaved at this time. They wasn't in Egypt at this time. Where the hell are they at this time period? But we're talking about here, the Canaanites and the ancient Egyptians at this time frame. We can't find these people. So the Bible tells us that the Israelites was enslaved in Egypt because they was basically growing in numbers. They was growing in strength. And the Pharaoh, who didn't know Joseph, he enslaved them instead of throwing them out of there because he believed they would end up taking over. Now, the Bible also talks about a prophecy that God gave Abraham saying that this would happen. Now, they basically got this story from what happened between the ancient Egyptians and the Canaanites. Now, we go back to this article. It goes on to say, the peace and prosperity of the old kingdom ended in years of civil war and discord, 2130 to 1980 BCE, known as the First Intermediate Period. The Pharaoh Metu II eventually reunited Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt to begin the Middle Kingdom, 1980 to 1630 BCE. It goes on to say turmoil once again boiled in Egypt as the Hyksos, foreigners of Canaanite origin, took control of Lower Egypt in the Second Intermediate Period, 1630 to 1539 BCE. So now understand what happened here. This is where they kind of got the story from. So you have the Hyksos, who are of Canaanite origin, coming into Egypt or coming into territories of the Egyptians and basically getting into skirmishes with the Egyptians. So the Egyptians realized these people were of Canaanite descent. So they basically said, all you Canaanites, y'all got to go. Y'all got to get out of here. So if you're going to stay, any Canaanites who stay, you have to follow Egyptian rules. It's going to be a curfew. You got to follow Egyptian customs and culture and stuff like that, or else you got to go. So they believe a lot of those people who left end up joining the Hyksos and coming back and eventually taking over Lower Egypt. Also understand that the Hyksos are believed to be of mixed race, that they are half Canaanite and half something else, or Canaanite and something else. We can't figure out who exactly they was mixed with, but most scholars believe that they were of mixed race, and half of them was Canaanite. Now let's go back to this article down here. It says, in 1456 BCE, Pharaoh Thutmose III won a decisive battle against a coalition of Canaanite rulers at Megiddo. Now understand, Megiddo is basically northern Israel. This is basically what the Greeks call Armageddon. That's where they get it from. Armageddon comes from here. Now, the great Pharaoh recorded his triumph in Egypt, and he talked about this. But understand, 1456 BCE, 1456 BCE, we're talking about when was the Exodus. Now, the date that they give us for the Exodus is between 1446 BCE and maybe 1250 BCE. Now, I'm not saying any of the dates that I use, I'm not saying that all Israelites agree on it, because it's one of the things that smart Hebrews don't do. They don't give you any dates because the dates never fit with anything. But you got to date something. So we're going to go with the official dates that they give us. And it's 1446 BCE and maybe 1250 BCE. But we know that's not true. The problem with these dates is this. The date of 1446 BCE puts the Exodus during the rule of Thutmose III. So that would be weird that a man named Moses actually freed Hebrews from Egypt during the reign of a pharaoh named Thutmose. So that's kind of suspect right there. Another thing is this. The Bible doesn't speak of Thutmose III. You would think that they would know the pharaoh's name and put it in the Bible. It does speak of Ramses. Now, the whole problem with Ramses being the pharaoh under the Exodus is he wasn't pharaoh in 1446 BCE. So let's go to the second date, which is 1250 BCE. But we know that he wasn't pharaoh at that time as well. His reign ended at 1213 BCE. So who were they enslaved under? The reason why they want to use Ramses is because when you go to Egypt, when you look at the hieroglyphics, you can see Ramses bashing the skulls of what looks like slaves and chasing down and running people over in his chariot, just the way they describe the pharaoh in the Bible. But what they don't tell you is these were the Hittites. They were not slaves. There was not Jewish slaves. There was not Hebrews. These was the Hittites that you see in those hieroglyphics. They also point to hieroglyphics that show people that look like they are in bondage, look like they are slaves, but they don't tell you that this was during the Hyksos reign, and most of the people you see enslaved were the Egyptians themselves. So even if they was enslaved under Thutmose III, and let's say the Exodus happened, they wandered for 40 years, they were still in Egyptian territory under Egyptian rule. Even if they was enslaved under Ramses and they wandered for 40 years and then ended up in Israel, they would still be under Egyptian rule. We know for a fact that the Egyptians were still ruling Phoenicia. We know that Ramses III lost it in 1156 BCE. So this will be, you can factor in a time, and the Egyptians are still there. We found artifacts showing that they were still in Israel during that time. We know they was there. We can't find any proof of this whole Exodus, of the Israelites being in Israel during that time period. Nobody knows, which means it never happened. So let's start bringing all this thing together, because I'm going to show you what has taken place in this history. And you can piece it together when you start going back and looking at certain things. And this whole thing really begins with the rule of the Ptolemies. Everything starts when the Greeks take over Egypt. Now, we know that the Persians conquered the Phoenicians, and when they did so, they amassed an army large enough to go ahead and conquer the Egyptians. Now, after they conquered the Egyptians, they went on into Ionia to conquer the Ionians, but the Ionians got help. It says, in 498 BC, supported by troops from Athens and Eritrea, the Ionians marched on, captured, and burnt Sardis. However, on their return journey to Ionia, they were followed by Persian troops and decisively beaten at the Battle of Ephesus. So now you had the Persians going into Ionia. They was getting help from the Greeks, but they still managed to conquer the Ionians. Now, later on, Darius I, because the Greeks helped the Ionians, they went on and marched into Greece to try to conquer the Greeks. But the Greeks beat them at the Battle of Marathon. And this is the whole reason why Alexander and the Greeks went on into Egypt to conquer Darius I and wipe out the Persians inside of Egypt. So now we're talking about the Greeks conquering Egypt. They have control over Egypt. understand, they actually conquered Israel before they came into Egypt. So Alexander the Great died 323 BCE. Then we get the rule of the Ptolemy. The whole Ptolemaic era begins here. Now understand, in history, as far as history is concerned, this is where the Old Testament comes from. We don't get no Old Testament without the Ptolemies, without the Greeks, period. So when you try to trace it back to the origin, we're talking about the beginning of the Old Testament. Officially, when you go back and look at the story, it goes back to the Septuagint. And according to history, how did we get the Septuagint? How did the Septuagint come about? It all goes back to the letters of Aristeas and LXX. This is how this whole thing's supposed to have begun. Now understand, we don't have the original Hebrew version of the Old Testament. We don't have it. So all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we get the Septuagint. So we got to see, where did the Septuagint come from and how did the whole thing come about? And for that, we point to the letters of Aristeas. So now understand, the letters of Aristeas is just as suspect as the Tanakh. It's just as suspect as the Old Testament. The only difference is we can actually look at the letters of Aristeas and trace it back to a people that have a proven history that we can see. We can actually trace it back to a people who is, proven, it has a history. We know about the Ptolemies. We know they existed. We can prove it. As with the Tanakh, we can't prove the existence of Moses. We can't prove the existence of these people. We can't prove what the Old Testament is saying. So as far as the Old Testament, the history of it lies within the book itself. We can't go outside of it and validate it, period. But with this letters of Aristeas, we can do this. Now, I'm not saying that it's correct, because it's obviously not. And a lot of scholars, every serious scholar, agrees that the letters of Aristeas is bogus. And I'm going to get into that later. But the whole thing about the letters of Aristeas is talking about how the Septuagint came into place. So basically it's saying that, the librarian of Ptolemy, the first Philadelphia, it's basically said, we need a Greek version of the Hebrew law. So he tells Ptolemy, and Ptolemy basically spends all this money and frees a whole bunch of slaves to get the Jews to make this copy for him, to go ahead and do this translation. So he gets 6 elders from each of the 12 tribes of Israel to come to Alexandria, Egypt, to do the whole translation. So, Septuagint means 70, but it was really 72 people who basically translated the whole thing, in 72 days, according to the letters of Aristeas. Now, when you start reading the letters of Aristeas, the librarian is trying to convince Ptolemy that he should release some of the Jews in order for them to get the Jews in Israel to actually do this whole translation. Now, he goes on to say that, you release some of them, it'll be like in good favor, it'll be a good thing for them, it'll be basically a good look. And that he basically goes on to say that we all have the same God, except that we call our God Zeus. So when you start reading it, he's trying to convince Ptolemy, and Ptolemy eventually agrees. That's the beginning of the letters of Aristeas. He's explaining what's going on and what happened and what led up to the whole thing. It's in very, very good detail, which is why it's suspect and why a lot of people don't believe it. There's too many details in it for somebody to write it out like that. So when you go on to read it, it's basically, the whole thing is suspect, and it goes against the history that's proven. So the whole thing is, if the letters of Aristeas is correct, then I mean the rest of history as we know is wrong, because when you look at the whole war between the Persians and the Egyptians and the Greeks, the letter basically goes against everything we know and prove about that war. It goes against it. So if the letters is correct, then it goes against history, and history is wrong, so that can't be. But if it's false, then it basically proves that the Greeks went on ahead and created the Old Testament. It gives a lot of validity to that story. Okay, so letters of Aristeas. In this part, I want to read real quick because I believe it's an important part. It's a very long letter. There's a lot to it. So if you get a chance someday, go online and find it and read it and study it. Because when you start to compare it with actual history, when we start to compare it with the Bible too, and we start to compare it with what we know, then stuff doesn't fit. It don't work out when when you start to compare it to what we know. So it says here. Go down to letters of Aristeas, start at 35. It says, King Ptolemy sends greetings and salutations to High Priest Eleazar, since there are many Jews settled in our realm who were carried off from Jerusalem by the Persians at the time of their power, and many more who came with my father unto Egypt as captives. Large numbers of these he placed in the army and paid them higher wages than usual. Now understand what he's saying here. He's saying that he took Jews. Now let's go to the Hebrew Israelite, definitions of Jews. According to them, they were black. They were black people. Like I said, I'm not disputing that. But according to this letter, we're talking about the white Greeks took black Jews and put them into his army to fight against black Egyptians. This is what this letter is saying.